Okay, and everybody on Zoom, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, all right, well, thank you everybody for being here today. I am going to hand it right over to our presenter. So we have Dr. Christine Angelini today, who is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Engineering. And she's going to be doing a presentation today called Catalyzing Mutualisms and Multi-Sector Collaboration and to sustain our rapidly changing coasts.
All right, thanks.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Allison. All right, thanks everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be an SNRE. I mentor some students in this program. So I'm going to get right into this and start with an introduction about myself. So let me just see. So as Allison mentioned, my home as a faculty member here at the University of Florida is in environmental engineering sciences. As you're going to hear from the work that I do that's coming out of my lab. I'm very much a coastal ecologist. We do a lot of experimental ecology. I love working, with my gang of students that you see here, taking off our field sites in Sapelo Island, Georgia. Kind of the spaces that I work in as an ecologist are, my home is in salt marshes, and most of my talk is going to be about that. But we work in mangrove systems as well, oyster reefs and beach dune systems. Basically, wherever we have the opportunity to look at this kind of intertidal, salty freshwater interface and interrogate the interactions between plants, animals, the environment, as they relate to how biogeochemistry sort of functions in these systems and the cycling of sort of nutrients and compounds through these systems. Also, how they're physically morphing over time as sea level rises and food web shifts, sort of what's the fate of these systems from an ecogeomorphological perspective. And then we take this perspective and really use it to inform how we restore and design these coastal landscapes. So the other hat that I wear these days is also, I've got to figure out how to get this advancing. Let's see. Is as the director of a relatively new program here at the University of Florida that's called the Center for Coastal Solutions. So you may not have heard of this yet, but I'm the founding director of this program. We started in October of 2020, and we're really all about connecting faculty, students, and staff with external partners, sponsors, and stakeholders. So relatively new, but we have a really vibrant network of basically people that go out and work on solutions for our coast. And I'll end my talk with an overview of that. So a couple takeaways from my seminar today are that mutualisms, these kind of mutually beneficial relationships are vital to ecosystem resilience and ecosystem service delivery. And we need to really think about how we build these into how we manage and restore natural systems. I'm going to make an argument that animals are vital. They play a vital role in controlling the geomorphic evolution of coastal landscapes, essentially how their footprints sort of expand and shift over time. And therefore, we can't just think about restoration from a plant perspective or a hydrology perspective, but we need to think about this from a whole food web systems. And then we're going to talk about how basically my perspective of how we're going to restore the health of our coastal waters, as well as the systems that, attract us to go to the coast, requires an all hands on deck approach. So we need multiple sectors, multiple forms of expertise, need to be activated and coordinated for us to have a hope of kind of sustaining these systems in the future. All right, so talked about the coast a lot. Let's talk a little bit about kind of getting down into what is going on at the coastline. Here in the state of Florida, about 70 to 75% of our population lives in coastal counties. Globally, the coast, within 50 miles of the coastline, is home to 40% of the human population. So disproportionately large numbers of people living in close proximity to basically this interface between the land and the sea. And, but it's under threat, literally hosting that number of people for, centuries, but amplifying in recent times is that we're losing the habitats that define the coast through direct development. But also there's a lot of things that run off from basically our human sort of footprint on these landscapes. So the coastal sort of ecosystem that you see, embedded in this Florida landscape is affected by, the imprint of humans on water quality and other forms of pollution, plastic pollution, for instance, of bottles being thrown out in the trash that end up kind of in our waterways. We also have an imprint of extraction. I mean, humans are pulling things out of these landscapes on a regular basis, whether that's all the hooks that are in the water of extracting fish and targeting different fish and shellfish and pulling those out of these systems. But we are literally manipulating basically the composition of species that are in these landscapes through that extractive kind of function. And then, of course, they're on the front lines of climate change as well. So very implicitly, sort of rising sea levels, this is where that plays out in these coastal landscapes, both from the sort of human communities that are living on our coast, but also the vegetated landscapes that you see, you know, in the background of this landscape. Intensifying storms, they make landfall in these communities and on these ecosystems. But especially here in Florida, we're seeing an impact, particularly of extreme heat and acidification. Shallow coastal waters are exactly where the water heats up really fast. I see Julie sort of nodding in an area of work, right? These are kind of water baths that can really heat up. So basically, we've got this collision of stressors. So, you know, we have lost and continue to lose the vital ecosystems that sort of sustain human habitation in these landscapes, as well as the benefits that they're serving to us as people. But basically thinking about how we as, you know, people living on the coast and caring about it, how do we halt this degradation? It's not an easy task. And the coast itself is extremely complex set of processes that play out and collide here in the coastal zone. So we have, you know, fresh water surging off of the land, ocean water sort of pushing along the coastline. They mix in really complex ways, and they affect basically in dynamic ways the ecology of these systems, how water moves, as well as literally how whole landforms are shifting and moving around the coastline. So this is a picture of Southwest Florida after Hurricane Ian hit. 3 days after the storm hit, it's a satellite view. And what you're seeing is surging out of kind of the watershed are the pulse of basically fresh water carrying all kinds of material from these inland areas out into the coastal zone. Just to give you an example of, you know, we have the day-to-day mixing of materials at the coastline. We also have major events that pulse material and drive a complex set of interactions that sort of play out in our coastal zone. So it's not easy to pinpoint basically root causes of change when you have so much going on. But also from basically thinking about proactive measures related to our coast is very difficult to think about who you activate to work on coastal solutions because the human influence spans multiple layered jurisdictional boundaries. So if we think about the Peace River Basin that you see, you know, the watershed here draining into Charlotte Harbor, this is a series of 7 watersheds that span about 20% of the landmass of the state of Florida. If you think about what's causing water quality degradation in Charlotte Harbor, this is not just, you know, the local communities that are surrounding Charlotte Harbor. This is, you know, the center of the state and what's happening in Orlando. It's the management of Lake Okeechobee. These are all different state entities, communities, counties, federal agencies that are playing out to basically influence water quality here. And if you start to think about, okay, well, what about the ocean pressures that are on, you know, Charlotte Harbor? That's an international space, right, of all the basically the nations that need to come together to counteract sea level rise and climate change, right? So who do you activate and how to make change is exceptionally challenging as well. All right, so this has been the crux of basically my career, really, since I started as an undergraduate until now, and you'll see how it's kind of evolving through my students and also the work I play in organizing the center, is how do we sustain our rapidly changing coasts? And I think our role in coming from an academic institution is that we equip those that are living in our coastal environment with the tools and resources they need to take proactive measures and think strategically about management. And I include this photo here to make this point because this is a home in New Smyrna Beach where the homeowners have literally gone along the beach and collected palm fronds, and they're trying to catch sand to regrow the dune in front of their homes. So this is, you know, how do we take the collective expertise, the power we have in as an institution, and all of the network that we have through the University of Florida and put it to work to basically equip homeowners like this with the tools they need to sustain, you know, a livelihood or manage their whole communities. And, you know, anyway, so I found it heroic that they're putting in so much effort, but, you know, this is not going to necessarily protect their home from the next hurricane that's going to hit them. All right, so let's talk about essentially the work that I really lead as in my lab and how it contributes to this bigger picture. So I'm going to introduce you to salt marshes. So these are intertidal grasslands that form in temperate areas around the globe, essentially wherever it's, too cold to sustain mangroves along the coast, you've got salt marshes. We value them for their carbon sequestration services. They haul in carbon, they bury it in their sort of waterlogged soils. They are really powerful drivers of sort of blue carbon storage. They sustain both recreational and commercial fisheries. We'll talk about how they influence water quality, and they also serve as this giant buffer for storm surge, right? So this is kind of critical services provided by marshes. And the perception is about these landscapes, and this has been sort of embedded in the literature for decades, is that it's the feedbacks between the dominant grasses, which you see sort of on full display in this picture of a Georgia salt marsh at high tide, how water flows across these landscapes and kind of moves in tidal channels and drains out during sort of flood and ebb tide, as well as the delivery of sediments that really sort of are what define where our salt marshes are, how big they are, and how vibrant they are. And often the way that we're thinking about kind of the management systems is where and why are there weak points in these systems, and we can address those perhaps and sustain them over the long term. And so what I would say is I'm going to sort of talk about the role of basically animals as a counterpoint to this common perception, but also where are these systems naturally resilient to stressors? And let's basically think about management and restoration through that lens. All right, so we think about this kind of intertidal flooded landscape. Inevitably, you might think about what is sea level rise doing to these marshes? So I'm going to show you a little bit of data from across the southeastern, kind of the South Atlantic bight across, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And so here are what the trends have been in rising sea levels and, what its sort of potential implications are for these intertidal landscapes. So what you're seeing is the sea level, basically the water level records from the 3 tide stations that are maintained by NOAA from 1940 until this is 2019. And what you're seeing is that, historically up until about 2000, we had sort of a moderate rate of sea level rise of between, 2.1 and 2.9 millimeters per year across this region. However, if we look at the recent slopes in the last 20 years, we have a dramatic acceleration, basically a doubling of these historic or more of historic sea level rise. And so to sort of set the stage of like, what does that mean for these intertidal landscapes? We looked at basically the record of how quickly marshes are vertically growing to keep pace with sea level rise across this region. So what you're seeing is data binned from 4 different approaches for measuring essentially the vertical growth of these marshes. They're constantly building elevation by trapping sediment and building root material. That's how they vertically grow and respond to sea level rise. And what you see is that essentially there's variation, and sort of this is a culmination of all the measurements that we could find across the southeastern US for how quickly marshes are building using these different techniques of lead to den dating, sediment elevation tables, feldspar marker horizons, which you put out some basically ground up lime, and you look at basically how much the marsh has built on top of that. And the take-home message from this is that historically, in historic rates of sea level rise, our marshes were about keeping pace with sea level rise, maybe not quite there, but certainly in time too, in the last 20 years, which are what these rates of sea level rise are, if we compare those to how quickly the marshes are building, they're not even close to keeping up. So although historically, these marshes, were maybe keeping pace with sea level rise with some variability, they certainly haven't been doing so fast enough since then. So questions kind of driving the first kind of section of our talk is, what is the role of animals in sort of affecting the trajectory of these systems? And where are marshes particularly resilient to basically these escalating rates of sea level rise? So the animal focus of a lot of my work has been the rib mussel. So these mussels are filter feeding bivalves. They grow in mounds that form on the marsh surface. And it's a mutualism between the dominant vegetation in the system, which is cordgrass or Spartina alterniflora, which provides basically heat relief for these mussels that grow in the mud, which can get to be 120 degrees if there's no vegetation cover. And reciprocally, these mussels basically filter feed a lot of fine particulates out of the water column. They process that through their guts, and they deposit basically fertilizer. So they're fertilizing the vegetation. So we have this really nice bidirectional kind of mutualistic interaction. And we know that basically this kind of power of like supercharging plant growth and actually supports the ability of these marshes to withstand stressful events such as drought. And this is a picture of an area where the vegetation has died back during a drought event, where we have mussel aggregations. You see these little patches of remnant vegetation. That's where the mussels are. They've allowed the vegetation to persist to really stressful periods of time. So just a little bit more about sort of this mutualisms. These mussel aggregations, they're a minor part of the landscape. 0.1 to 10% of the total marsh cover is occupied by these mussels, these mussel aggregations. And we know that that's tightly controlled by basically the amount of volume of tide water that moves over these marshes. And through their filter feeding activities, basically these mussels are providing a really intimate connection between the tide water that you saw flooding over these marshes and the ground surface. They're basically the hyperconnectors between those two buckets. So my student Sinead did a dissertation that largely focused on the role of mussels in affecting the functioning of salt marshes. This is kind of a cross-sectional view of what one of these mounds looks like, where you're seeing kind of, in white space here are crab burrows. They facilitate high densities of crabs. And so one of the questions that was driving her dissertation work was, are mussels contributing to the salt marsh sediment budget? Are they potentially helping these systems keep pace with sea level rise through that deposition function? And this is, what I wanted to kind of emphasize in this kind of cross section is both, what one of these mounds looks like, but also that they literally have elevation and that you see the material kind of looks a little different on these mussel mounds. That's all that pseudofeces and fecal material that they deposit. And so there's the potential for sediment to be bound into that and helping basically supplement these landscapes. So Sinead was an overachiever as a student. So what I'm going to show you is basically a series of evidence that she pulled together from field sites. This is Sapelo Island, Georgia. This is kind of the study domain. This is along the sort of the barrier islands in coastal Georgia. And she distributed her experiments across a couple of different sites in this region. You don't have to pay too much, but these are intertidal salt marsh landscapes. And so this is the series of work that Sinead did as a grad student to answer these questions about sediment and the role of mussels in supporting sediment. So the first thing she did was put out filter papers, which are like little discs of paper that you can put out for short periods of time, basically over 2 tidal cycles. And she looked at how much sediment is coming into basically getting deposited onto these marshes on and off of mussel mounds, on creek levee areas to get an idea of what's coming into these systems. And she did that over neap tides when the tides are relatively shallow, spring tides when the tides are really large, and across each one of our seasons across the year to say, get an estimate of how much coming into this system as a result of mussels and in non-mussel areas. We also did an experiment in which we took fluorescent dyes and chalks and fluorescently labeled that pseudofeces material and measured how it spread and worked its way across the marsh over multiple tide cycles. We also fed mussels fluorescently tagged chalk and looked at how basically their filtrate moved across the landscape to answer the question, are they just locally depositing this material or is it supplementing the whole landscape? She did experiments manipulating the presence of mussels and vegetation at different elevations. And to cap it all off, she and a whole bunch of undergrads experimentally moved over 200,000 mussels across a marsh landscape to look at what are basically the longer term effects of mussels in affecting the sediment budget. So she had plots where they've removed all of the mussel mounds. They took those mussels and they added them to an experimental creek head, and then they had a control area and they monitored basically how the elevation of the marsh responded over time. Okay, so just a couple of take homes is that the mussels are playing what you might think is not that big of a role. Between 2.8 and 10.7% of the sediment budget coming into these, they're boosting the sediment budget by about 3 to 11% across different marsh locations and seasons and tides. But if you think about, does that help a marsh kind of win or lose in the context of sea level rise? Having 10% extra sediments coming in is probably really important for basically persistence. We also find that these biodeposits, they're not just locally accumulating on those aggregations, they spread and supplement the entire marsh. There's spatial heterogeneity and where this sediment comes into the system. And so it's primarily coming in around the heads of these tidal creeks at lower elevations where the mussels can really haul in a lot of material, and that the larger the mussel mounds, the more material comes in. And finally, this kind of large scale manipulation. This, what you're seeing here is a digital elevation model collected 3 years after basically manipulating the mussels. In green are kind of lower elevations. And as you go to sort of yellows and reds, those are higher elevations. And what you're seeing is a lot of lower elevations around the removal creek head, a sort of a flourish of sort of red and hot yellows around the sort of the addition creeks, and sort of a more yellow landscape around the controls. And so when we quantify basically the elevation changes of areas where we've removed sort of mussels, we lost about 5 centimeters in average elevation, where the mussels were pulled out of the system, and we're gaining about a centimeter, a little over a centimeter in elevation over a 3-year time period, where we boosted mussels on the landscape. So this was the first time where we were able to show that basically the sediment budgets of these marshes are not just defined by the dominant vegetation, but that animals can play a substantial role in driving basically those feedbacks. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about mussels in the lens of another stressor in this system. So upstream of Sapelo Island, which has been the home of a lot of our work, there's Atlanta, and there's a lot of development. There's a variety of different industries along the coast, particularly chemical and wood manufacturing, or sort of wood processing plants and paper mills. There's also military bases that have a variety of different sort of contaminants associated with them, and a whole bunch of homes that are still on septic tanks. So what's coming out of there and sort of starting to get all the way downstream in what seems like a relatively pristine system is kind of an imprint of what we generically call cultural eutrophication, the influence of humans driving excess nitrogen coming into these systems, and that fueling basically organic material that's in the water column. So largely in, the algae that's growing in our tide waters. So this is of interest, basically to potential stressor to this system. In addition, this is a system where we've got these climate change effects, and there's this generic perception that, these marshes are these really important sinks of carbon. They play they're a valuable blue carbon habitat. And so thinking about kind of the organic material that's coming into these systems and what's its fate into these landscapes. I had another great graduate student. She's close to finishing now, Sydney Williams. And so she has been working for the last several years on answering, are mussels mitigating this imprint of cultural eutrophication and climate change through their influence on nitrogen and carbon regulation functions of these marshes? Are they essentially putting how marshes process organic material on hyperdrive through their active filtration and biodepositions? So her figure did not come out as pretty as it looks on my computer, but this is a conceptual figure under the first paper coming out of Sydney's dissertation. So she had a couple of basically hypotheses about this. So, and I'm really sorry this didn't come out so clear because it's a really beautiful photo figure. So the first hypotheses have to do with, her expectation that mussels are not only increasing the percent, but also the biomass of what we're calling allochthonous organic matter coming into these systems. Essentially, how much organic matter is coming in from phytoplankton, the algae that's in the water column, versus, carbon and nitrogen that's internally being processed by the marsh itself. Are they hauling in organic material from outside the system? And the estimation was yes, and that's coming into the marsh, through their active biodeposition. Other hypotheses are that, that imprint of the sort of the marine-based or outside the system carbon gets stored in the marsh sort of sediments. And then we also see this cascading to increase basically the storage of carbon and nitrogen that's locked in the plants, the longer-term storage of this material in the systems. And finally, she had hypotheses about some of the density-dependent interactions that might be playing out in this marsh system, that with increasing mussel density, the larger and more packed the mussels are in the mounds, that we'd see an increase in basically the carbon and nitrogen storage and functioning in cycling, as well as on the landscape scale, as mussel aggregations get more and more dense on the landscape, that the whole basically landscape is more efficient at pulling in carbon and nitrogen and storing it. So to test these hypotheses, she did a whole bunch of biogeochemical analyses, particularly looking at stable isotopes and different forms of carbon and nitrogen in the tide water, in the biodeposits that come into this system, and into soil cores. So you're seeing different kind of ways that she sampled the system, as well as soil and plant samples that were collected across basically different aggregations of different sizes and different densities of mussels on the landscape. All right, so what did she find? So before I go forward, yeah, essentially the forms of organic material that can come into these systems, you know, it may come in the form of basically cestonic sort of particulate organic material. And this is really what we care about, are basically these mussels helping pull out phytoplankton out of the water column and pulling in this extra source of material. Or are they helping sort of regulate the cycling of organic material that's bound up in benthic microalgae? So the surface of these marshes grows a thick mat of microalgae that grows in the surface of the mud. And then the third kind of compartment of organic material that may influence cycling in the system is the vegetation itself. And so we're looking at basically proportions of this material essentially cycling through the system. So what you're seeing here is essentially the composition or the proportion of essentially material that's coming from above and below ground plant material, from benthic microalgae and from the phytoplankton, and samples that are just coming from basically what's floating around in the water. That's the cestonic sort of particulate organic material. Essentially mussel biodeposits, that's what's in the dashed line, and then in areas where there's no mussels, but just cordgrass only. And so what I want to sort of share with you is that essentially there's this major shift in the proportion of material that's comprised of sort of this phytoplankton in areas where we've got mussels. Essentially, they're pulling in this kind of phytoplankton out of the water column. So the take home here is that, you know, mussels, that confirms her first hypothesis that there's an increase in both the percent and the biomass of material getting pulled into the marsh system where we have mussels than where we don't. And then related to some of our other hypotheses, you know, this imprint of marine phytoplankton gets carried down into the sort of the soil that's bound into the marshes, and even sort of rockets up through the plants and the vegetation as well. So why this sort of matters, or why you should care about all of this kind of really nice sampling and analysis that Sydney did, is that what is generally showing is that mussels, by being there, are helping our marshes function as water filters, essentially. They're allowing our marshes to better pull in the crud that's in the water column, if you will, that organic material, particularly the phytoplankton, bind it into their tissues, and then that gets built into basically the material that's helping build the marsh itself. So they're transforming that carbon and nitrogen that was phytoplankton, that was kind of that imprint of cultural eutrophication, and getting it bound into the tissues of plants in these marshes. And, you know, by, you know, elevating not just sort of that cycling function, but also the magnitude of storage of carbon and nitrogen on the marshes, they're increasing the blue carbon benefits of these marshes as well. So, all right, so I'm gonna just tell you a couple fun little stories now. Those are sort of a brief overview of some of our results. So just to, you know, summarize what I just shared is that, you know, in this picture of a salt marsh, what you're seeing is, you know, in a tidal creek, all these little dimples that you see, do you guys all see that? These areas on the marsh that are like slightly brighter green, those are all the mussel mounds that form in these Georgia salt marshes where we work. So everywhere that you have one of those mussels, you know, kind of everywhere that you see these kind of little elevated hummocks, the mussels are there, and they're enhancing the sediment that's coming into these systems that help build their elevation. And they're also basically amplifying the carbon and nitrogen accumulation and cycling in these systems. So the other sort of, you know, so we know from this work that animals can be really, really important in these systems. So I've had other students and collaborators that I worked with that are asking the question, are other animals, you know, modifying the functions and services of these marshes? And So I'm just going to tell you two quick anecdotes about this of work that I've had, I've really enjoyed being a part of. So if you fly over South Georgia and you look down at a salt marsh, you're going to see these really fascinating features. They look like basically semicircular bare spots on the heads of tidal creeks. Do you guys see these? And if you start looking across the marsh, there's not one there, but oh my gosh, this whole sort of flank of tidal creeks, they've got all these bare footprints, and you can literally see them if you fly out of Jacksonville or Gainesville and fly up the east coast of the United States. And these are a signature of sea level rise and the burden that it's placing on these marshes. Essentially, when tide waters come into these marshes, they flood up these tidal creeks, they push through the creeks. And they also, when water drains off these systems, they drain out of these tidal creek heads as well. Because we have a larger volume of water now circulating over these marshes because of sea level rise, it puts a lot of hydraulic stress on the heads of these tidal creeks. And there's one animal that loves basically a well-flushed area of the salt marsh. And this is basically the purple marsh crab. It's one of the most beautiful animals in the marsh, in my opinion. It's called Sesarma braticulatum. They congregate in really high density burrows along the heads of these tidal creeks where there's, really sufficient flushing. And what we've shown through this work is that basically the sea level rise outpacing the growth of these marshes is setting the stage for these crabs to congregate on these tidal creek heads. And what they do once they're formed is they accelerate the rates of creek formation and elongation into these marshes. So you're going from a marsh that's sort of relatively stable to one that is rapidly fracturing. So we're going from a landscape with a lot of high marsh and not much low marsh to now a whole bunch of creeks. This is basically the canary in the coal mine for the degradation and deterioration of these marshes. And it's being accelerated by sea level rise, setting the stage for basically this amplified ecological interaction to play out that involves these crabs. So historically, this is kind of the food web that govern the dynamics of these marshes, where you've got, cordgrass facilitating mussels, which facilitates invertebrates, and they are, controlled by nekton predators. We now have basically a morph of the kind of interaction chain that's kind of controlling the ecogeomorphic sort of evolution of these landscapes, where you've got Sesarma sort of triggered by sea level rise, eating cordgrass, affecting basically persistence of mussels. I didn't even talk about the nekton that are in these systems. There's a lot packed into this paper. Go check it out if you're interested in this. But the idea is that essentially the context of sea level rise has set the stage for what we're calling Sesarma becoming a keystone grazer in the system. Relatively small area on the landscape. There's not that many crabs that are here, but because they're in the right spot, they're having these cascading effects on essentially how the marshes are responding to sea level rise, but even how the whole food webs are structured. So you'll notice, actually, just getting back to our mussel story, is that around these tidal creek heads, there's no mussels there, right? You don't see many of those little mussel blips. And that's because the predators can really get into the marsh where these crabs have mowed down the lower vegetation. And so there's a feeding frenzy around these fronts. So that mutualism I was talking about gets dismantled by this interaction as well. Okay. All right. So one other sort of fun story about animals is I've had the pleasure of working with my former advisor from here at UF, Brian Silliman. He's now at Duke. And Brent Hughes, who was a postdoc, working with Brian at the time, working out in Elkhorn Slough, which is in Central California, around Monterey, California. And this is not a healthy marsh system. There's been impoundments of water flow. You can see like bright green flanks of algae in this system, highly eutrophic system. California's kind of ag fields are all around this marsh landscape and funneling nutrients here. And so there's been really rapid degradation of the marshes, and really sort of what it looks like in Elkhorn Slough is this. You've got piles of algae that slough onto the edges of these marshes. And you see this kind of calving off of whole chunks of the salt marsh. And this is really being facilitated by another burrowing, grazing crab. In this case, it's another beautiful example. It's Pachygrapsis craspispes, and it's also called the line shore crab. They excavate burrows in really high densities along the edges of these California marsh creeks. But there's a success story here, which is that basically sea otters are coming back into this system thanks to decades of conservation. And they're not just foraging out in the seagrass meadows in this system, but they're coming up into the tidal creeks and they're eating lots and lots and lots of shore crabs. And they haul out in the marshes and take naps and stuff like that too. It's a really amazing system to work in. So sorry, this first figure is not that great, but what you're seeing in the top chart here is sort of a time series of the populations of sea otters in Elkhorn Slough. They were initially reestablished as a part of a kind of essentially a population rehabilitation program. And then they become a more self-sustaining population over time. So you've got kind of over 150 otters in this estuary system now. And what they're doing is that, you know, there's spatial heterogeneity in where they kind of forage in the marshes. So, but generally they're all over, you know, the system now. So what you're seeing is, you know, before otter expansion and after otter expansion, sort of from 2010 forward, we see this increasing number of sea otters in tidal creeks. The number of crabs consumed per day is rising, you know, per unit area. So these, you know, these otters, they have to eat a ton in these cold California waters. And what's really amazing is that for decades, they've been able to track the food webs of what sea otters are eating because they grab things off the bottom and then they come up to the surface and they lay on their backs and they eat. And so you can get really detailed understanding of what's in their diets. So we know that they're eating line shore crabs. We can literally sort of track and see that. And what we're seeing after otter expansion is essentially a truncation in that creek bank erosion rate. Essentially, they're preventing that geomorphic decline of this system through their extraction of all those shore crabs and reducing that kind of burrowing burden on the edges of creeks. All right, so just a quick synthesis from this part of my talk, and then I just have a few things to say after this, is that, you know, hopefully you have a warmth towards mutualism. And in the case of mussels, they're supporting ecosystem resilience, not only to drought, which I just barely alluded to, some of my work in that space, but also to rising sea levels and the function of these wetlands in sort of removing excess organic material out of the water column and thus improving water quality. Animals, I would say, are playing a really important role in regulating food webs, but that there's cascading benefits or sort of implications of that for the geomorphology of these landscapes. You saw our southern marshes fracturing, you saw this deterioration of these California marshes, but animals are playing particularly pronounced roles in that geomorphic kind of context and rate of change of our systems. And therefore, I think, you know, as we think about rehabilitating and conserving coastal systems, we need to take this kind of, you know, perspective of you know, bottom-up processes and plant feedbacks and hydrology, but also we need to start thinking about how do we properly manage the food webs that support more sustainable systems as well. All right, so that's kind of a portfolio of, or at least a flavor of the type of work that I do in my research lab and the types of approaches that we take to doing that work. But in 2020, I had essentially the challenge of starting a new center here at the University of Florida. 2018 was probably the worst year for harmful algae blooms in the state of Florida, both red tide sort of raging in Southwest Florida, blue-green algae blooms. It took place when essentially Governor DeSantis was running for governor, and it was a very hot political topic, which was what is Florida doing about water quality? And I got kind of asked with a team of colleagues from around campuses, where is UF's place in working on these issues? So I ended up forming a center, which is, you know, and the bigger question of, you know, in the lens of this program is, you know, what do we need to do to achieve our vision of cleaner waters here in the state of Florida, as well as healthier natural systems? I care about people and healthy communities and all that stuff, but what my real passion is that these systems maintain themselves and there's benefits to people. So that's really kind of the leverage point that we really care about, is our mission statement of our program. And there's just a couple things that I think, you know, are perspectives of mine that really drive what the center does these days. And I think that there's a fundamental role of how we advance science to deepen our understanding of what's really driving change at the scales relevant to management. So from my perspective, there's huge gains that we need to make in how we understand the interactions between the watershed the estuary and ocean processes and how they affect, in this case, water quality with cascading benefits to ecosystem health. And as we think about kind of the longevity of our coastal landforms, is that there's this multiple layering of processes, from interactions between sediments falling out of mussels and getting biodeposited on the landscape to large scale, basically, feedbacks that occur between, say, our navigation channels and the adjacent marshes that are controlling whether we're gaining or losing our coastal habitats. And so I think the role of our center is, thinking about how do we collect both high resolution, but also large scale data and integrate those with powerful models that resolve the complexity of water quality changes and environmental change at our coasts. And this can only be achieved by a fusion of multiple disciplines and also advanced supercomputing that can handle these powerful models and big data. The next major thing is, how do you go from sort of science to solutions? And so, we critically, as an institution, need to be delivering science that clarifies what the drivers of pollution or ecosystem loss may be. This is an example from the Western Panhandle of a project we've been involved in, that you're seeing where there's septic tanks in brown and, city, homes that are serviced by sewer in green. And this is, a driver of bacterial pollution that's pervasive in this region. We need hard science on looking at these, basically these drivers of coastal water quality change. But we also need to be delivering identification of feasible projects and policies and actions that can improve, that can lead to improvements. And this is sort of challenges a lot of us that are involved in fundamental science, is that we have to be involved in basically the co-development of both the science side and the solutions, and there needs to be a feedback between these two. And I think this really is only achieved by multi-sector collaboration. We cannot be doing this as an insular institution, those that are actually out in communities and taking action. And I see that Holly and some of our other folks from Extension who do a lot of this work are probably nodding and agreeing with this. But finally, it's one thing to have a solution. It's a completely different thing to see implementation and real change on the ground, where you feel like your community, or you see that your community is taking action. And that resolves essentially another step, which is, how are we handing off these solutions in a way that decision makers know what to do and they can take action associated with those, whether that's a policy change, whether that's a management action, whether it's literally ponying up your community dollars to invest in new sewer pipe. How do you get basically your identified solution to turn into an on the ground action? And that really has to mean, basically what has to be implicit in that is that this delivery of science and solution has got to be compatible with how decisions are actually being made around management actions and policy changes and infrastructure upgrades. And so I think this means that scientists not only have to work with multiple sectors, but we have to be working hand in hand with those that are making these hard decisions and understanding and building trust with these decision makers to see this outcome. So this is really what the center is all about, is driving this kind of three-phase process between science, solutions, and implementation, and catalyzing the talent we have at the university and our partners to do this. So we've had kind of 3 impact spaces since we've started. It's really kind of catalyzing different capabilities that we have across campus, calling it kind of like an academic incubator. We have really smart people in a lot of different areas here at the university. It's really about sort of harnessing that, working on water quality and integrating sort of watershed to ocean processes to work on water quality, figuring out how do we improve water quality in the state. We have another major focus on coastal resilience and rehabilitating coastal ecosystems. It's more of a restoration focus prong. And then thinking about the policy interface to improve coastal health as an interacting program. All right, so as I mentioned at the beginning, is that this is, a campus-wide team. We welcome additional participants and folks to be engaged in this effort. The people that you see on the screen, these are the students, the staff, our advisory board members, and affiliate faculty from across campus that are involved in the center these days. And that might be everything from just coming to the summit to check out what's going on. We have an annual summit, to actually leading projects that are deeply involved with basically the center's mission. And it's been a lot of work, I guess, from my end to start to build all these relationships and get people working in a shared direction. But we're now not super new anymore. So I'm starting to see some momentum being built. Just a flavor for where we work. Since October 2020, when we were founded, we now have projects kind of in a variety of corners of the state and kind of improving and expanding all the time. What you're seeing in orange are kind of water quality projects, and in blue boxes, these are where we're doing work on, say, rehabilitating coastal ecosystems. So an example is work that we're doing on Tyndall Air Force Base, on stabilizing and expanding dunes and marshes that surround this military facility to support the base's resilience to future storm events and sea level rise. So it's growing. We're building capacity and bringing in some projects that help us kind of move forward. But the other thing I want to highlight about this is you're seeing our project partners that we work with in all of these different sort of projects. They come from the private sector, the public sector, from other programs on campus, as well as from the NGO space. And so if you were looking to build new relationships that you need to, activate outcomes in your work, I may have a relationship with folks in those spaces to help synergize with. So this is about, I think the center's, greatest contribution is really in connecting talented people that are here, but also connecting those talented people to partners that may not be here that can help you propel your work. So just 2 more slides. Just an example of one of the things we're doing in the center that I'm really sort of proud of. My colleague David Kaplan has been leading this work that's about developing integrated models of Lake Okeechobee and all the watersheds that drain into Lake Okeechobee, as well as the sort of the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie River watersheds that sort of, drain water out to the coast, as well as coastal models to support the Army Corps of Engineers in better managing lake releases that will achieve reduced downstream benefits downstream impacts of water quality that can be sort of associated with release of nutrient-rich and sometimes algae-rich water coming out of Lake Okeechobee. And so this is a sort of a showcase of how we can work across multiple jurisdictions with many different partners in a powerful sort of modeling, data-driven sort of framework, with the impact being that, this work is equipping our state and our federal agencies to make more data-driven management decisions to achieve significant reductions in the severity and duration of particularly red tide, but also blue-green algae blooms across basically this entire sort of flank of the state. And so with that, I think, just final takeaways is that, I think I'm really excited to be working holistically about, working on, coastal management and sort of halting this deterioration that we see along our coast, and that being holistic related to how we're thinking about our natural systems and all the role of animals and physical processes and controlling them. It's been a great joy of mine to be working on diverse and dedicated teams that are coming from multiple disciplines and sectors and end users to identify problems and analysis and solutions. Sorry, I wasn't supposed to start this slide with that as the tone. What I would say is this is my call to action. That's what I'm supposed to say, which is I think all of you, especially the young ones in the room, is that your career is going to be about taking big holistic approaches. You're going to need to work on teams that are people that you do not understand what they do or how they do it, but you need them to get basically the big picture done. And so, and that's both in how you define the problem that you're working on, how you deliver the outcomes of that, and how you ultimately get to sort of solution implications. And so the big thing is that I think that our sort of future workforce has got to be excellent at communication and collaboration. And so I'm just going to tell one quick anecdote as I wrap up, which is one of my postdocs said, I'm having a really hard time getting students to talk in my class. And I said, well, you tell your students that they're going to have a higher pay grade if they're a great communicator, because they're going to be the ones that get tasked to be the project manager and to be the leader. If they're willing to open their mouths, if they're willing to communicate and talk to their peers, And I'm telling you, you cannot sit in a silo in your discipline or in your impact space and expect that you're going to basically move the ball down the field. And so as you're here, as you're, thinking about your own work, as how do you become a better collaborator? How do you better give back to the other people that you're working with? How do you also become a better communicator? Because that's going to be how we basically really move the needle, is not through our individual single action, but through collective action as we move forward. So with that, I'll wrap up. Here's my contact information. If you want to follow up in any ways, we're looking always for new folks in the center. We've got, social media and all that kind of stuff. If you want to kind of have a slow drip of what's coming out of the Center for Coastal Solutions, we're on LinkedIn and Instagram and X and all of that. And we also have a monthly newsletter, which I don't know if anybody in this particular room or online, but we feature the work of students and faculty and staff from across campus. So, it could even be an opportunity to promote your own work and get it sort of socialized with others. So thanks a lot, and I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if you want to chat. So thanks. Any questions? Oh, no. You got a clapping emoji. Okay, thanks for the clapping emoji, folks. That's great. It's okay too. Like my contact information's here, so I'm happy to take comments and stuff offline or follow-up conversation.
Hi, congratulations for your work.
Yeah.
I was thinking pollution is one of the drivers of biodiversity loss and habitat quality decline.
Mm-hmm.
And also I was thinking on microplastics.
Mm-hmm.
So these microplastics could impact the dynamics of the animals with their environment.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that topic?
I mean, I think it's a really big and important one, is thinking about, microplastics, macroplastics also. I was just meeting with colleagues at the Marine Loggerhead Center that, intake turtles and the amount of kind of internal, issues that they're seeing because turtles are eating plastics is substantial. It's a common thing that they see. And so, I mean, it's basically a variety. It's the compilation of our waste that's getting into our system that is, not degrading fast enough. I think all of it is a really, basically are those contributors to degradation in different ways. And so I don't work on plastics directly myself, but there's, I think it's a huge area for, but also a really challenging one from a management perspective as well. We can think about trash cleanups and all that kind of stuff as a part of that solution. And I think all of the work that goes into that, the debris cleanups, we just had a big coastal cleanup day just the other day. I think all of that's really valuable. But in the same way as like thinking about, we work a lot on, nutrient pollution as this contributor to decline. It takes like these multifaceted approaches to thinking about reducing nutrient pollution. In Florida, it's wastewater, it's urban and stormwater runoff, it's ag runoff, it's fertilizer on people's lawns. And so it's like, as I sort of tried to end with, it's like this all hands on deck approach of like, it's not just one thing that's going to move the needle, it's all the things. And therefore you have to, kind of think about it in that perspective. I think plastics is another example of that, which is there's not just one part of the plastic pollution problem that's going to solve it all. It's going to have to be like a full court press. So anyways, but I think the awareness of younger people on these pollution issues is a good thing, make different decisions. Happy to take any other questions. I don't know if anybody online has one too. And that's okay if you don't, that's fine. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience, and say hi if you see me around campus.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.